Welcome to our podcast. We're excited to have you guys back and listening to our podcast. My name is Madison. I'm the Executive Director of Peace Restored, and we're going to be discussing mental health and faith in our podcast, which is called Seeking Healing, Finding Hope. And this is a production of Peace Restored. We are a 501c3 nonprofit located in Indiana and serving women everywhere. And I'm excited for today to have Emily Key back in the podcast studio with us. We're going to continue our conversation on journaling and coping skills. If you didn't get to listen to our other podcast on it, we did 2 parts so far, and they were episodes 11 and 12. You'll get to hear more about what it means to have coping skills and a little bit about journaling. So before we jump into today's topic, I thought we'd do a little bit of a recap and talk about what we learned in the first 2 episodes, just kind of at a high level. And so you kind of would you like to go through some of the things that we talked about last time?
Yeah. So last time, like Anne mentioned, we talked a lot about coping mechanisms and skills, and also what it looks like to have unhealthy coping skills and healthy coping skills. And so one that we touched on was called a grounding technique, and that's basically just looking around and using your senses to bring you back to your center and your present time. And so that can help you kind of get out of your head. We also, related to that, talked about mindfulness, which is kind of similar, like being balanced with yourself and like taking the time out of your day to be aligned with your mental and physical health. Mm-hmm. And so we just talked a lot about that. And then obviously, if any of this resonates with you and you feel like you need to talk to someone about maybe unhealthy coping mechanisms that you have, or how to have healthy coping mechanisms, talk to a safe person, or obviously therapy is also a great way to kind of develop those.
Those are really great. So it's, again, for those who want to learn more about that, they can go back and listen to our previous podcast on that. But those are some really good things for all of us to think about, is integrating good grounding techniques, mindfulness, and either therapy or talking to safe people. And we all need safe people around us. That's the podcast Hill and I have been doing together, is talking about safe people and what does that mean to have a safe person. So if you don't know what that is, go back and listen to our Safe People podcast, or what is I think we titled it, What is an Unsafe Person? But we're going to talk about unsafe and safe people in that. And so that's good for you to know about, because you don't want to just talk to anybody. Right. Because that can be, you don't want to open up to the wrong person and then have that part of you, that trust broken, and that can be really hard.
Absolutely.
So a little bit of, I forgot to give a little bit of your introduction, so I'll do that now. So people will, in case if they haven't heard your podcast, I want to introduce a little bit and tell a little bit about Emily's history with us here at Peace Restored. She's been with us for a little bit. She originally came on to work with us on our social media. So she does a lot of the behind the scenes, working on our social media and doing that content. So if you see anything on there and you like the content, make sure to say hi to Emily on there, or and I'm sure she'll respond back. And then so if any of that on there. So we're on Instagram and we're on Facebook, and then we're also on LinkedIn. And so if you're in any of those platforms, you can go in and find some of Emily's work there. But then earlier this year, she's been transitioning into her role as a social work intern. She attends University of Indianapolis, UIndy, here locally, and is a social work student there. And so she's doing some of her internship hours with us. So we're super excited to have her on staff with us to do both of those roles. But she's really been stepping into that social work more and more over the last couple of months. So, which is why she's on the podcast with us. And this is really kind of her wheelhouse, is learning more about coping and journaling as well. So I'm so excited to have you here, and we can continue the conversation. So yeah.
Yep. Thank you very much.
Yeah. So you ready to kind of jump into today's topic?
Yes. It should be fun.
Yeah. So I think before we do that, some of the things we might want to I always like to think about things in questions. And some of the questions that kind of popped into my head as we were prepping for this is, when we think of journaling, what are some thoughts that somebody might think about? Because I think a lot of times when journaling comes up, there is an innate fear that comes up.
Right.
Have you ever heard anybody talk to you about journaling? Or?
Yeah, I know. Even personally, I always think, oh, I can't do that. I don't know what to say. Like, I don't know what I would even put down. It almost feels, I don't know, I feel like I've heard people say that it feels like a diary, like when you're a little kid, and that adults shouldn't have that. So yeah, there's definitely some negatives around journaling that go around.
Yeah. I also think some people might think like, well, what if somebody finds my thoughts? Like, what if I write down my deepest, darkest thoughts, if you will, or deepest, most intimate thoughts, and somebody reads them and I'm not ready to share them publicly?
Right.
That feels very vulnerable.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's very daunting to, it's one thing to think things in your head, but when you put it on pen and paper, or we'll talk about different ways that you can journal as well, it makes it more real in a way. And I think that also might sway people away from journaling or even making that leap to start journaling.
Yeah. I've heard people often or at times say, well, I don't want to journal because I don't know if I can do it well or I can do it correct. And I just want to challenge people with that question and say, well, what does it mean to journal correct?
Right.
You know, what does that mean? And we're not going to answer that right now. Hopefully we'll challenge people some of that thought as we're going through today. But the idea of journaling and journaling correct can really freeze us, because we can almost get into that legalistic kind of mindset or very regimented mindset of I have to do this and then this and then this. And because if I don't, it's not a proper journal.
Right.
And I don't know about you, but that feels overwhelming to me.
That feels very overwhelming. And I think that's why so many people might do it for a couple days and then you never touch it again, because it just is too regimented and it's just too much. It's supposed to be something that relaxes you and balances you. It's not supposed to be something that overwhelms you and makes you feel shame for not doing it or not doing it right.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so as we're kind of talking about the idea of journaling, we need to probably define what does it mean to journal. So what is journaling?
Yeah, so journaling can come in really very different forms. And I think that is like a big topic, or I think that is a big overarching theme of what we'll be talking about, is that there's not just one way to do it. And you should really alter it to what works best for you, because at the end of the day, that's what you're going to want to do. Yeah. And you're not going to want to follow someone else's template. But journaling is basically, how I think of it, is writing down things that you need to just get out there, and maybe a way to like organize what you're thinking, or to get something off your chest, or anything like that. Most people probably think of it as pen and paper, but it doesn't have to be pen and paper. Yeah. It can be, I mean, we have so much technology, it can be really anything like that. So just something where it goes from your brain onto something else in word form.
So some people might want to use their phone. Some people are very, especially I think the younger you are, the more you might be adapt to using your phone as a way to keep notes. And then sometimes that can feel safer too, because in your phone you can lock it up. Absolutely. You can put security on that. And same with if you have a tablet or a computer, you can do the same thing. You can secure or lock that folder so nobody else can open it. And so that can be like, oh, that's way different than having a piece of paper floating around wherever. But I think sometimes people there's that act of writing and putting that physical act of writing, putting pen to paper. Sometimes that's very therapeutic for someone to be able to do that too. So I think it kind of goes back to what you're saying. You have to find what works for you. I heard somebody one time say that they love to type out what they're thinking because they can take their aggression out on the keyboards. And so if they're having a rough day, they would tap even harder. And that, if you're an IT person listening to this, you might cringe. But from a therapeutic standpoint, there is a benefit to that, to be able to make sure that we are able to get that frustration out or to process through. It could be even like if you're typing slower, or whatever. The cadence could change. But there's lots of things that you can do depending on the medium, if you will, that you can use. The other thing I'm kind of thinking of as we're doing this is it might not be words that you use.
Very true.
Yeah. Because maybe
drawing, painting, anything like that.
Yeah, I did a group one time where we did Mod Podge, and we cut pictures out and pictures and words, and we put what we were feeling based on the pictures and words that we found. and we kind of decoupaged a page, and it was a journal, but we didn't have to write anything.
Right.
And it was a really good process to do that. So that might be another idea for people as we're kind of thinking, kind of brainstorming like different ways that you can journal. It's not
right.
There's not a box.
Right. And some people, using art and words, or like, start over. For some people, it might be easier if you're not very good at putting your emotion into words, starting with maybe drawing or cutting out pictures in a magazine or things like that aren't so much pressure of you putting into words exactly what you're feeling, because that can be really difficult too.
Yeah. Yeah, because sometimes we don't have the words, right?
Right.
And so then it'd be like, well, if I journal, then I have to have the words. But that's where that beauty of thinking outside the box, saying, okay, what can I do? What is it that's resonating with me right now that I can put into this journaling process? Because journaling the idea is basically taking what's in here and getting it out, right? And so whatever form that takes for you can be a journal.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I think that kind of goes back to the idea of we don't want to overcomplicate it, do we? Because if we overcomplicate it, that's where we can kind of get stuck.
Right.
Like it goes back to what we said in the beginning. If there has to be a certain, form, if you will, or formula to do this, here's my formula for journaling. You have to have this type of pen. You have to have the special journaling pens. You have to have the right journaling book.
Right.
You have to be at this time of the day in this particular chair. Well, what if when all those things line up, the thoughts aren't there to journal with?
Right. You can't force it out, because then you're not getting out of it what you're wanting.
Yeah.
So it won't be there.
So that's the beauty of journaling. It can literally be done anywhere, anytime. So we've kind of touched on some of the different materials we can use, but do you have any other thoughts or ideas of different mediums or different things that we could use?
Yeah. So we talked about like technology and like obviously the standard notebook. Another thing that I think could be an interesting thing to use, especially if you're using like words, are Post-it notes or note cards. I think those are a great way, especially if you're doing like a gratitude journal, which we'll kind of get into what that is, or some sort of journal where you're reminding yourself of what good is happening. It might be nice to have that as Post-it note or a note card that you can kind of stick wherever you want them to be, so that throughout your day you're seeing them, and that it's not just, oh, I thought about that in the morning, by noon I don't even remember what I put. So I think that could be kind of helpful to have those reminders throughout the day of like, yeah, this is what I'm thankful for, this is what is going good. And so, or if there's something like if you're a spiritual person, you need something encouraging throughout the day. If you journaled and you realize that you need encouragement, maybe you could find scripture and put that on a Post-it note and stick it on your mirror somewhere like that.
Yeah, I've heard of people who will put the Post-it notes on their steering wheel.
Oh, okay.
So every time they get in their car, it's right there. And I love that idea because,
can't ignore that.
You can't. It's like, you should be looking at your steering wheel, hopefully. So it's right there. It's right in front of you. So it's that idea of putting it like on your mirror, like you said, like where you're going to see it at.
Right.
And so, it's being really creative with different ways that we can journal or take notes or it's keeping that in front of ourselves. And what is it that we need to remember? What are we processing through? I just, as you were talking, something that popped in my head is I remember I knew somebody once who would do like, they don't have to necessarily have to be the size of a 3x5, but like a 3x5 card where you could chop them. You could even chop them in half. And they would just write a bunch of things down, and then they would put an old like binder ring around them.
Oh, okay.
And then they would carry them in their purse. And then whenever they were somewhere, so maybe it was scripture verses, or maybe it was affirmations, or maybe it's something they're working through, they would just be able to pull that out, and they could like read through the things that they've been journaling.
Oh, okay.
And they would just, so if they were waiting in a line somewhere, they would use it as a way to kind of, process through some things. So they would just sit in their line. They'd get out their little binder the little 3-ring clip that they had made, and just sit there and read through them. And I thought that was
very creative.
Yeah.
Yeah. And a good way to bring yourself back to being balanced, and kind of like we talked about earlier in the past podcast, like bringing yourself back in and not being so in your head and out in another world spiraling about in some sort of anxiety.
Yeah, because sometimes that's what we need. We need something to bring us back to the present. And sometimes it's really hard for us in that moment to go, okay, what are the things I need to do? But if you have something like that in your purse or a bag or whatever, and you can just pull that out really quick, go, oh, here's that. And it's like journaling and grounding, mindfulness all kind of combined together. And you're just like, okay, I'm just going to read through this and it's going to pull you back to center.
Right.
And I don't know. I love that they did that. And, whenever I still see them every once in a while, whenever they are in that space and they're using that, they're in such a good place. And it's such a good tool for them.
Yeah.
And I bet I'd imagine it would work really well for others too.
Yeah, it's a very good idea.
Yeah. So what are some times that we can practice journaling? I think we kind of talked about that at the beginning, that sometimes we can get a little regimen. Like I can only do it in the morning. I can only do it at night. I can, maybe we have other onlys other only statements we put on, like I can only do it when I'm alone, or I can only do it, I don't know, when I'm at home, So when are times that we can journal?
Yeah. So I think the biggest thing is that you should do it whenever you're willing to be vulnerable with yourself. So if you're sitting down to journal and you're not feeling like you are willing to go into a space where you'll write what you need to write, or however you're journaling, doing that in the way that you need, then maybe take a break and recycle back to it at some other point during the day. Because like we kind of touched on earlier, if you're not being vulnerable and honest with yourself, then you might not be getting out of it what you need to get out of the journaling. And so like Anne was touching on, there's definitely different times of day that you can do it. And I think having more of a gentle approach to it is probably the best way to go. Like if you do like doing it in the mornings, then go ahead and do it in the mornings, but don't like beat yourself up if one morning you can't. And you can always do it another part of the day. So I think really whenever you have a moment that you're willing to be vulnerable and able to take the time to be vulnerable is the best time to do it, no matter what time of day that is, or whenever it is, it's just the time to do it.
Right. Just being kind of fluid with it and being okay with it being fluid.
Right.
I think is important. I love that you brought up that you have to be willing to be vulnerable with yourself, because if it's like you said this earlier, like we can't force it. You can't make yourself do journaling. I mean, I guess you could, but you have to be willing. You have to it's almost like you have to have a willingness to do it. And so when you sit down and be willing to sit down, and you may not even be feeling it in the moment. We're not saying you have to be like, oh, I'm busted at the seams to write down all these things. You could just be like, I think with that vulnerability comes the willingness. And so sitting down, like, okay, this might be hard. It might be challenging. We're not saying will be always easy to sit down and journal your thoughts, but it's that intentionality of like, I'm going to willingly step in this space. I'm going to willingly be vulnerable. I'm going to sit and just kind of do what I need to do in this space. And while that can be challenging, it's also such a reward that can come from that as well.
Right. And when I think of journaling, I think of daily, and it probably just from like movies, seeing people like do their diary and it's like a daily thing. But I think it's important to kind of get out of that box as well, because it doesn't always have to be daily. There's some examples that we'll get into that aren't necessarily a daily thing. It can be when needed. And so I think it's also important to be like honest with yourself. If it's not a daily thing that you're ready to be vulnerable and get it all out there, then don't force yourself to do that, and take it how you need it and not how you feel like you should need it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely that, giving yourself the freedom to have the cadence of when you need it. Because if we set a schedule up or whatever, it can feel a little overwhelming. Sometimes though, if you are in therapy, your therapist might recommend, so we're not overriding whatever your therapist is recommending, but if you're in therapy with somebody and they're like, hey, we really think for right now in this space, you need to do this daily, follow the lead of your therapist. Yeah, please do that. But also, if you aren't in that space where you're working through this with a therapist, or maybe take this information and talk to your therapist, your counselor, and say, okay, I've listened to this podcast on counseling on journaling, and I want to bring it to you in this counseling session so we can kind of work through this together. And that's perfect to do, because you need to have because they're going to know a little bit more about your specific situation. Understand the things that we're talking about is very broad. We're talking about this from a very broad standpoint, not specific to one individual. And so hopefully, if you're listening to this, you can listen to that kind of that caveat, if you will. we've talked about, kind of when to journal, different mediums of journaling. And so now we need to really kind of talk about what are some different ways or different things that we should journal about.
Yeah, I think this can be really broad, as we've kind of said, and varies from person to person and like what your experience is. And so one really common one is when your emotions are feeling like too big and you just need to get it down on paper, because in your head, I'm sure as you all know, things can go from one thing to the next really quickly. And so it's can be really helpful if you just sit down and you just write it out and get it out what you need to say, rather than just letting it build up and build up and build up inside of your own mind.
Yeah. So being able to sit and process all the things. Because sometimes when you wait for that build up to get there, then it's even harder to sit and write out everything, to do the journaling and whatever medium you're doing it, because it can feel almost overwhelming. But then almost, if you do get to that place, that might be when you need to use some more of those creative mediums than just the traditional ones. I'm trying to think of some different out of the box kind of ideas. Like maybe there's some things that you just, you need to write about, but you don't want to save them, and you need to get some frustration out. You could go to like a park and you could write some of those overwhelming feelings on a rock, like in some kind of like dry erase marker or something like that, and then throw it in to the water. And there's something therapeutic about that. Obviously do it within safety and all the things. Don't throw it at people, just throw it into the general shallow to the water. But there's something about that. And that's another way that it's not like traditional journaling, right? But it is, we're writing the words out. We're processing what we're thinking. So maybe you're feeling angry and you go get a rock and you write angry on it and you just toss that into the water and let it wash away. And it's just releasing of all those build-up stressors. And so being able to do that. So earlier that you tapped on the idea as well of gratitude journaling. So you want to expand a little bit on that, because we've talked a little bit about the kind of, if you will, the heavier, the more, we might relate to negative emotions. And we relate maybe to gratitude as more of the positive emotions. Would you want to expand a little bit more on what is a gratitude journal? What's the benefit of that? And why might someone want to use it?
Yeah, so a gratitude journal is basically when you take the time to sit down and acknowledge what you're grateful for, so what you have gratitude for, as the name suggests. And so this can be really nice because, kind of like you were saying, it's so easy to focus on the negative, and that's where our brains usually go. We a few bad things might happen, and we're like, oh, my life is terrible. And so it's really nice to center yourself, whether it be daily or weekly or whatever it looks like for you, and write down the things that are going good in your life and the things that you're grateful for and the people you're grateful for and things like that. And then that can kind of bring you back down to the reality of your situation, and that not everything is bad, and that there are things in your life that you have that does put a smile on your face and helps you get through the day. So I think it's a really great journal to do, just to center yourself and to remember at the beginning, the end of your day, whatever it looks like, about the things that you're blessed with in your life.
It's so good for us to think about all the gifts that we have, because sometimes I think we can get so focused, like you said, on the negatives. And when we get in that space, it could be hard to see the positives or the blessings that we have. I know when I've worked with clients, I've suggested them about doing a gratitude journal, and they'll be like, I don't see anything good going on. I don't see something to be thankful for. And sometimes what happens is we're looking for the big things, like nobody's given me a car recently, or I haven't received a $1,000 bonus anytime lately. I'm like, okay, I mean, I hear that, but there are gifts around us everywhere. And I think it's sometimes being really intentional and thinking about what is it that is a blessing. Maybe you wake up in the morning, you look out your window, and it's just a beautiful sunshiny day, and the sun's shining, and the birds are chirping, and that's a gift that we get to enjoy that, and we forget to take pause and go, while it seems very simplistic, but it is such an amazing thing because one, we get to see, we get to hear, we get to experience that. Not everybody gets those gifts.
Right.
And for us to be able to do that, and then for God to give us the beautiful sunshiny day and be able to have the beautiful song of a bird, those all things are things that we can rejoice in.
Right. Absolutely.
Sometimes it's just that we, have a job or have somebody who is doing life with us. There's sometimes it's just the little things that we need to take into account. A couple of years ago, I read a book called 1,000 Gifts by Ann Voskamp. I don't know if you've read that book or not, but it's the same premise. So she goes through this process of how do we find the gifts. So she spent I think it was, if I remember correctly, it's been several years since I read the book, but if I remember correctly, she took a process of going through and writing every day down the different gifts until she got to 1,000.
Oh, wow.
And then she kind of just kept reading through them. And her rule for herself that she gave herself was that she couldn't repeat any of the gifts. And so she had to continually think of something new. So she has children, so she couldn't every day wake up and say, I'm thankful for my kids, right? But it was okay, what specific thing? So as the list kept growing, she had to really look harder.
Right.
And to be more intentional with her gratitude. And I think that's a really neat lesson for all of us is how can we be more intentional with our gratitude instead of broad? I didn't get the car donated, today. I've never had a car given to me, but, that's okay. But there's plenty of other things that I'm grateful for that God's blessed me with and that I've been given. So I think gratitude journaling is such a good way, like you said, to center yourself and to bring you back to what is it that God has given instead of what's been taken.
Right. So
then the other thing is you talked about really kind of just writing anything comes to mind. Have you ever heard of the concept of dump journaling? Okay. So do you want to expand on that and tell everybody about what dump journaling is?
Yeah, so it's kind of what it sounds like. You just dump anything that comes to mind and you just go for it and you just write it down. And it might seem weird at first, but if the things that you're dumping out of your mind is what your brain's focusing on and what you need to get out there. And so sometimes there's a freeness that comes along with that of there's no expectations. You could write, I'm hungry or something like that. And there's no shame in that because you're just going with whatever's coming to mind. So I think that it can be really helpful, especially if you're having feelings that you're not exactly sure where they're coming from, maybe the dump journaling, where you're giving yourself the freeness to just say whatever, can maybe help you kind of figure out where those things are coming from. If something keeps coming up, maybe you can dive deeper into, why am I always thinking of that? Or something that can help you kind of get a look into your mind without being judgmental of yourself.
Yeah. I always like to tell people when they're doing dump journaling, because again, it kind of goes back to we want to kind of self-edit. Like when you go to dump journal, no punctuation, no grammar. It is literally whatever thought is in your mind. And I'm and because we work with women here, and I think this is more of a female trait than a male trait. And Nolan's listening in the background, so maybe he can tell me if I'm wrong. But I think it's more of a female than male trait is that we tend to flitter from thought to thought pretty rapidly. I think men just kind of stay in that lane a little bit longer than we do. And so because of that, what I tell women when they're dump journaling, it is okay to be like you were saying, it's what I went for dinner. Wait a minute, I'm really sad. That person didn't talk to me today. Wait, I need to go to the grocery store and I need to go buy some corn. And our minds will do that. And sometimes we want to take our minds and kind of control them, say, I have to stay on this linear path. Sometimes we just need to let it be. And just dump it all out. Even if it doesn't make sense. And I always tell people it's okay if your journal looks chaotic. Yeah. It's okay.
Absolutely.
It's even okay that if you're journaling, you just scribble. Maybe that's all you can do.
And that can give you sight into maybe what's going on with your emotions and your feelings. Maybe that you didn't even know were there.
Yeah. So maybe you're writing, all of a sudden you just get really frustrated and you just start feeling the need to scribble. Okay.
Do it.
It's okay. There's no rules. Yeah. So journaling is such a neat and unique thing that we can use. Sometimes we are resistant to journaling, but I think there's such a benefit to it. There's things that we can learn through the process of journaling. If you were to share one kind of like overarching benefit that you can think of from the conversation we've had today of journaling, what would it be?
I think the biggest benefit for me when thinking about kind of what we've talked on today is the ability to make journaling what you need it to be in that moment. You could be a very like routine person and need it every single day, and then maybe a few months down the road you're like, okay, I am in a place now where I need it weekly. And I think that's the beautiful thing about it is you could change how you do it and the strategy that you use whenever you need it to change.
Yeah.
And I think that's the really important part about learning how to journal is that there is no way how to journal. It's how you need to get whatever's in here out. And so I think that's in my mind, one of the biggest things when thinking about starting a journal or doing it again or finding a better way to do it.
Yeah, find what works for you, to summarize, right?
Yes.
It's okay that what works for you today may be something different than what works for you in a year from now.
Right. Absolutely.
And sometimes the reason why it changes is because you're growing.
Yep.
And that's good. So, but thanks for, I've enjoyed this topic. It's been really good. I appreciate that we'll be able to jump into this and talk more about journaling today. We're going to do more podcasts on this in the future. So if this has been a topic as you've been listening that's been something that you're interested in, I encourage you to keep coming back to our podcast and listening. In the meantime, while you're listening to these podcasts, I would encourage you to subscribe to both our podcast, whether you listen to us on YouTube or through our podcatcher. If you subscribe and like or comment on these, it helps get this out to more people, and also you can share them out to your friends and family and so forth, because we really want this content to get out. So hopefully, again, that you find this valuable and you can do that. If you'd like more information about Peace Restored, we'd encourage you to go to our website, which is peacerestored.net, where you can check out more information about the organization, what's going on. If you'd like to learn, if you're local and want to learn about our major events coming up, you can do that. And if you'd like to learn about our expansion of the organization as well, there's information on that. So again, thank you so much for listening to us as we wrap up our discussion today. I hope that you will stay tuned as we continue to share practical ways where you too can seek healing and find hope. Join us on our next podcast where we'll continue to discuss mental health and faith, and come back next time for transformation, growth, and power. This is Peace Restored.